The number of people that have these authentic experiences and yet aren't standing in their true power, aren't standing on their ground because something hasn't been published scientifically is just, it's just crazy to me. There's the never-ending question of how do we, how can we really help people decrease their suffering? Or there's the ultimate question of truly knowing your true nature, and then all suffering disappears.
Based on what you've just said, it appears as though the cerebrospinal fluid is a sort of conduit between the divine and humanity.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that your word of conduit is spot on. And I think that the cerebrospinal fluid is actually the biological mechanism for Kundalini.
Audacious Rebel.
Today on the path of the Audacious Rebel, we're joined by someone whose journey through science and spirit reminds us that true healing doesn't just happen in the body. It begins in the unseen spaces of the soul and the silent intelligence of our biology. Dr. Mauro Zappaterra is not your typical physician. He holds both an MD and a PhD from Harvard Medical School, where his pioneering research explored neuronal stem cells and the profound role of cerebrospinal fluid, not just in brain development, but in human consciousness and healing. His groundbreaking work has graced the cover of Neuron and has been featured in the New England Journal of Medicine and Psychology Today. He is board certified in physical medicine and rehabilitation, currently serving as Director of Regenerative Medicine and Clinical Research at Salvation Medical Group, and staff physician at the VA Greater Los Angeles Healthcare System. But what makes Dr. Zappeterra truly unique is how he fuses the clinical with the mystical, bringing together modalities like polarity therapy, Reiki, and craniosacral therapy in his quest to reduce suffering and optimize the full human experience. He is a physician, a scientist, a healer, and above all, a seeker of joy, someone who sees medicine not just as a science, but as an art form of loving life. Dr. Zappeterra, welcome to the path of the Audacious Rebel.
Thank you very much for this invitation. It's an honor.
Well, the honor and privilege is all mine. I mean, I've seen a lot of your work. It is totally mind-blowing. And I think it is so timely, especially when you see what is happening now in conventional holistic medicine and science as we dive into the quantum realm. I've been saying for quite some time that I am convinced that a part of our biology includes spirituality. And recently I came across a Dr. Miller in one of her books called The Awakened Brain, where she was able to prove via MRI scans and scientific research that the person that is spiritual, their brain is quite different. Now, you study conventional medicine at the highest level, Harvard, MD, and PhD, which often stands at odds with alternative healing practices. So, how does someone with such a strong scientific background arrive at a place where modalities like Reiki and polarity therapy are not only accepted, but integrated into your medical practice? What opened that door for you?
It's a constant curiosity of truth and what helps decrease suffering. As a scientist or a physician, you're trying to help people heal. You're trying to help people decrease their suffering. You're trying to help people function better. And as a true scientist, we're always asking questions. What's the best treatment? What's the best path? How do we know this is the best path? What are the studies that have been done? Have there studies been done that have looked at this difference? If not, what are some of the studies that can be created? So it's just an undying curiosity for truth, for the nature of our being, And we continue to ask questions. We never stop asking questions. And there's no question that should be left unasked or unanswered. Because if we're not asking the question, then we're essentially choosing to skew our views in a certain direction or not. But we need to ask all questions. And so that's really where it comes from. It's just really a dying nature to help people, to help decrease suffering, but also to continue to advance what we know further. And there's something about continuing to do research and what has been published scientifically that allows people to believe it, that allows people to remain grounded, that despite all their authentic experiences that they may have had as an individual person, as an N of one, I say, that when something is published, it gives them ground to stand on it all of a sudden. And much of my work, the number one comments I get is, thank you so much for talking about this, because this is what I've felt for 15 years. This is what I've felt. You are describing it in such a way that I have been living this for 15 years. And people thought I was, crazy or nuts or, that it wasn't true or anything like that. And the number of people that have these authentic experiences and yet aren't standing in their true power, aren't standing on their ground because something hasn't been published scientifically, is just, it's just crazy to me. Now, do we stand on everything? No. Everything is a constant flux. It's a constant question. It's like a dance.
Yes.
You feel something going one way, you go with that flow a little bit. Is it the right direction? Well, you keep going. What do you notice when you're in that? Right. So every moment is a new moment that you ask the same question or a new question, and you keep kind of flowing and dancing. Could you go down a certain path and determine that, this isn't really, although I had this experience and it was fairly authentic, it doesn't really seem to manifest in this way? Absolutely. And so there's no right or wrong. You just retract. That's the process of medicine. That's the process of science. And when you retract, you keep on sending out little appendages, and you keep on exploring. You keep on asking questions. What's this? What's that? And to me, there's two ways of looking at that. One is there's the unending question. There's the never-ending question of how do we, how can we really help people decrease their suffering? Or there's the ultimate question of truly knowing your true nature, and then all suffering disappears. And so it really kind of, it's those to me are, then there's no more question, and there's no more questioner. And so is that the ultimate goal? For some people, that might be the ultimate goal. And that it doesn't matter what diagnoses you have. It doesn't matter what the physical treatments are, et cetera, once you've actually tapped into your true nature, it is what it is. And that's the beauty of it. And, that's the love, that's the joy, that's the divinity of our process and of healing. And so, that's kind of where I'm at. It's just an undying curiosity of what is and how to help people get to that point.
It's something, because we have this ideology that science is absolute, and what science is, that is, even though science is on a quest to discover and is discovering themselves. I mean, they're also baffled by what is being revealed in quantum dynamics. Of course, I am certain there was some degree of ostracism when you would have taken this part. I mean, I reflect on the work of people like Dr. Bruce Lipton, when he spoke about the biology of belief and the kind of adversity he would have faced. When you began embracing energy based modalities and holistic practices, were you ever concerned about being ostracized or discredited by mainstream medical community, especially coming from such a prestigious institution? Was that ever a risk or fear you carried?
No, it was. It wasn't. When I entered, it's very interesting, and maybe I was blessed to be around really supportive people, which I definitely was. But when somebody presents you some information, right? Let's say you're going and you're learning about something that might be new to you. You have your certain frame of reference that you've been looking at this world from. And when somebody presents you something new, if you're okay with it, your frame of reference may be expanded. You might actually expand your frame of reference, but it's all being filtered through a certain foundation of knowledge that you have, right? How does this make sense? Does this make sense to me? Is this completely out there, right? If you told me right now that you can elevate or you can fly, I would ask, well, what do you mean by fly? You can start flapping your arms and okay, and then I want to see it, right? Okay, show me, right? Show me how you do it. And I'm always curious by if one person can do it, or if one person has experienced it, then that mechanism is present in the physical world that we live in, and so therefore that's something that can be taught. Right? But as we are presented with new information, or as we expand our own horizon of what we're interested in, right, we go into it with an open curiosity, almost as if we're a child and we're investigating a butterfly for the first time. We're open to it. We don't know what it does, right? It lands on our hand, and these things that are straight, flat pieces of paper are fluttering up and down, and it's looking at me, and it has, and then all of a sudden it flies away, and we're not used to it, and we're like, wow, and we're just taking it all in.
Right.
And so when that happens, or when that happened, I would just process it through my filters of going through medical school, of having my own experiences, my N of one, my authentic experiences myself. Okay, this is what I know from an anatomic and physiologic perspective, right? This is what I know. This is what they're telling me. How does this relate to what I know? How does this fit in, or does it not? Is it completely separate? If it's completely separate, I don't discard it. You don't get rid of it. You hold it, right? It's almost as if it's on the periphery of your being. You don't disregard it, but it's sort of like, huh, that's interesting, right? I don't know what this is. Do I want to continue to investigate it, or do I just want to do it? Do I just want to discard it? That's actually a choice that we have. And so, going into it, even chakras, for instance, or even, energy, whether you're talking about meridians, whether you're talking about chakras, whether you're talking about energy centers, and even, prior to that, whether you're talking about is there some sort of etheric form of us prior to physical form, whatever it might be, right? There's a certain investigation of that from the parameters that I knew. And so, for instance, let's take chakras. The first time I heard that, what are these people talking about? I'm a skeptic, right? What in the heck are these revolving vortices? There's no revolving, right? And then you drop into it, and you say, okay, this is interesting, because where people are localizing, right? Now I'm going down to the physical form, right? Where people are localizing these chakras, there's actually very interesting nerve plexuses. There's actually a collection of nerve bodies in the human body that are actually overlie quite beautifully with the chakras. And there's even one that is called the sacral plexus, right? So we have the same word for one of the chakras, whether it's the cardiac plexus, whether it's the solar plexus, whether it's the cell bodies in our pelvic or sacral area, whatever it might be. There are energy centers, right? So now if you look at a neuron, right, not a neuron as a method of transmission of information, or a method of transmission of, let's say, electricity, electrons, molecules, ions, whatever you want to call it. But let's just call it a method of transmission of information, and that's a method of transmission of energy. Right? At the end of the day, it's transmitting energy from one point to another point. And at these areas that you call chakras, that there's a collection of cell bodies that are called plexuses. Prior to understanding anatomy, right, prior to us having x-rays and MRIs and CT scans and doing open body dissections and stuff like that, could there have been people who have a sensitive nervous system, who have a very sensitive proprioceptive and introspective physiology and way of just sensing real subtle sensations in themselves? Could they have actually sensed that at these plexuses there were increased energy centers at that area simply because of the amount of energy that was present in the cell body, in the nucleus of the neurons, because they were all aggregated in that area, right? And so that's an absolute yes. There's no question. There's absolutely no question that could be, right? So now it becomes what people might be talking about as, these chakras. Well, this is actually something that we find in the human body as plexuses, right? When you look at meridians, whether you're looking at an energy meridian or anything like that, the number of nerves that travel up and down the hand or the arm, or the number of lymphatic vessels, that bring back your lymph, all of these, when you tap into them, when you actually develop a sense of introspection, you can feel these, and you can map them out. There are people I know who, have mapped out every single channel, over 16,000 channels in the human body. How do they do that? Well, there's an interoception of themselves that they can sense and feel. And literally, with their awareness and with their attention, they can follow these pathways, these channels, these meridians, and they can map them out and draw them, right? And so that to me is how you bridge it, right? So when I would talk to my attendings and talk to them about chakras or balancing the energy centers or something like that, it was really about talking to them about the plexuses. What's the energy around the plexuses? What's the energy around the central nervous system or the peripheral nervous system that needs to be balanced? And I went into a specialty called physical medicine and rehabilitation, and specialize in pain management. And what's interesting about pain is it's a subjective experience. So pain is very unique. I can smash your finger with a hammer and smash somebody else's finger with a hammer. You're going to have very different experiences, and that's dependent on a number of things. But it's a very subjective experience. And so, I was at the Brigham and Women's Hospital doing a very intense anesthesia rotation. And anesthesia there, the anesthesiologists there were the ones who took care of all the pain patients. And I was, it was specifically a pain rotation. And I went to one of the grand rounds, in anesthesiology in pain management, and he says, he puts up this slide, and the title of the talk was, pain management. Are we practicing evidence-based medicine? Are we actually is what we do, right? Is that evidence-based medicine? As much as, we're at Brigham and Women's Hospital, we're one of the best medical schools in the world, one of the best hospitals in the world, and yet are we practicing? And how can we be better physicians, right? And so he puts up a slide, and I'll never forget this slide because it was totally in line with everything that, is my philosophy and everything. He puts up this slide where he looked at all pain management treatments or modalities that had actually been published on the NIH, the NCBI website, which is it's a website where all the journals undergo peer review, and so it's sort of a vetting website for some of the best literature out there in science, right? So he puts up this slide of all the modalities in pain management that had been tried and studied and published about, right? And there were over 120 different modalities that had actually been studied. And he was one of the premier pain management physicians at Brigham. And he says, I was taking care of this lady who had neck pain, and she had neck pain for 6 years. It was from a motor vehicle accident. And I was doing everything that I knew. I was offering her medications. I was giving injections. I was doing all the different types of injections. We were doing things like massage and physical therapy. And then one day she comes in and she goes, I found a craniosacral therapist up in Vermont. I think I'm going to go see him. And he goes, well, there's no evidence to suggest that craniosacral therapy can help. And she goes, well, that's fine. But if it helps even a little bit, right? Now we're talking about that subjective human quality that enters, right? What's the risk? Well, I'm not jumping off a 50-foot, a 50-foot bridge or something like that. I'm simply going to a craniosacral therapist. Okay, so she goes to the craniosacral therapist, comes back to clinic after going to the craniosacral therapist. Her pain was gone. Gone. She reports it, right? She's known this physician for 6 years. He's been doing all these treatments. Pain it decreased. It got better maybe after an injection, right? Pain was gone. And he goes, that's impossible. Right?
Wow.
I know your spine. I know your imaging, right? And sort of goes back to the physical, right? I know this, I know that. We've injected all these points. There's no way you're making it up, right? And again, pain is subjective, right? Whatever that means, you're making it up. What does that even mean? Her brain is creating an experience for her. She's coming back and saying, my pain is gone. She got 3 more sessions. Her pain was completely resolved. And he tells this story in the grand round. And he goes, do I now refer patients to craniosacral therapy because of her experience coming back and educating me about it? And he goes, you bet you I do. Because for her pain, for me to take care of her for 6 years and not be able to get her pain under control, and for her to go and do this modality, right? Now, does it help for everybody? No, but for her, it did. And we know that that's the same thing for medications, for injections, right? If I give you one medication and I give somebody else the same medication, you might have better efficacy of it than somebody else. And so, we need to stay open, right, to all possibilities. And that really dives into human consciousness, to human awareness, because all possibilities, right, on the realm of awareness, or on the realm of consciousness, all possibilities are possible. It's all there, right? It's a matter of, can we tap into that realm of pure total potential, totality, pure potentiality, the void, let's say, and bring out something that is that and manifest something that's possible, that's physical, that's on this plane of visual plane that that we interact with predominantly. And so that's the way to, for me, that was the way that I've interacted with then people my whole life, is how can we, as opposed to how can we divide, right, is how can we bring together? How can I use language that is conducive, that is understood by both groups? And how can we bring these groups together so that they're understanding each other as opposed to fighting each other and battling each other, right? When we talk about whether it's craniosacral therapy or massage or polarity or Reiki or whatever we want to talk about, there's different levels. There's different realms that we can approach that at, right? And understanding where people are ready to take in the information is where we need to actually start to have that dialogue, right? If you're not even considering some sort of ethereal realm or some spirit, then going there, you're going to find a lot of resistance.
Yes.
Right? But if I can talk to you about the nervous system, right? even if you've never heard it, I can show you a picture of the brain. I can show you a picture of your spinal cord. I can show you an anatomical model of all the nerves coming off your spinal cord. And I can tell you that, when you move your hand, it's because there's a nerve that sends a projection down into your hand or your foot, and you can move it, right? And you're actually controlling that, and that's because of this nerve. And there's something called the autonomic nervous system. And when we look at, have you ever felt like, have you ever had a thought that made your stomach feel like it had butterflies in it? And almost everybody will say yes. Have you ever had a thought that all of a sudden makes your hands sweat or your heart beat stronger? Yeah, I have. Okay. Well, guess what? That is your autonomic nervous system at work, right? Have you ever gotten startled or frightened in the middle of the night, and all of a sudden you felt frozen, or you felt as if your heart rate was beating at 120 beats per minute? Yeah. Was that you saying, "Oh, heart rate, increase my heart rate to 120 beats a minute because I might have to fight somebody or run away"? No. That was your autonomic nervous system doing that for itself because it sensed a threat. Your nervous system was actually perceptive. It has a perceptive quality, and it sensed a threat, right? That is our autonomic nervous. So people have had those experiences, right? And then we ask questions such as, well, if you've had a thought that can increase your heart rate, have you ever had a thought that decreases your heart rate? Mm-hmm. And most people go, never actually thought of that. I think I have, but I'm not sure. Okay. Right. So let's actually go into that. So that's the autonomic nervous system. That's the fight or flight. You must have heard that term before, right? Fight or flight nervous system. It's activated when we feel stressed. It's activated when we feel like we need to survive, evolutionarily. When we were being, when we were being chased by a lion, we had to either fight it or run away. And so this nervous system has actually helped us survive. This is a survival mechanism that is present. Wow. Okay. Now, right? Can you imagine that in the world that we live today, we're not living in the jungle. We're not living in the middle of nowhere anymore, where we're getting attacked by lions, tigers, bears, et cetera, but that this nervous system is still active and it still actually helps with our survival. But we get stressed by different things. We get stressed by our job. We get stressed by the people in our community. We get stressed by money. We get stressed by politics. We get stressed, whatever it is. Right? And so we're actually activating this nervous system all the time. And yet we don't have practices in our life or in our culture that activates the other nervous system, the parasympathetic nervous system, its balancer. So if the fight or flight or the sympathetic nervous system is the accelerator on a car, The parasympathetic nervous system would be the brakes. And what we want is, we don't want one or the other. We don't think that one is good or the other one is bad or anything like that. But what we want these nervous systems to be resilient. We want them to be balanced. We want them to be mobile when needed. That when you wake up in the morning, you activate your sympathetic nervous system and you can go on about your day. And when you need to rest or digest your food or fall asleep, that you activate your parasympathetic nervous system. When you want to rest and, just chill out with your friends or family, that you want to activate your parasympathetic nervous system, but you do so in a balance, right? Well, the problem is that majority of people don't actually have that activation of the parasympathetic nervous system. We are over sympathetically driven because of the stress that we have, and so that's the nervous system that we're exercising.
Right.
So breaking this all down, right? Mm-hmm. Could you imagine, regardless of what treatment you're getting, right? Whether it's Reiki, whether it's massage, whether it's craniosacral therapy, that actually what these treatments allow us to do is to work at this nervous system level, to work at the level of the autonomic nervous system, to help bring balance to the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system. And this, and that's just one entry point, right? So then you enter that way, and what happens is that through the treatment, right, or through maybe for the first time in their lives, they actually take a moment and rest on a table, right? Like a massage table, because they don't get that. So just by making an appointment, now you're resting on the table. And now, right, take you through, and you feel for the first time some sort of relaxation occur. Right? And that's the entryway for everybody, because everybody understands the nervous system. Everybody understands stress. Everybody understands the hyperactivity, the heart rate, the tension, the butterflies in the stomach, and things like that. And so those are the entryways for almost everybody, even physicians, neurosurgeons, et cetera, because they understand. If you undergo a major back surgery or neck surgery and you're stressed after the surgery, guess what? You're going to have a worse outcome. There's going to be a worse outcome from that. So they understand, right, the need for stress reduction or balancing the nervous systems or having people rest and activate their parasympathetic nervous system. And so that's the entry. Those are the ways of finding those common methods of communicating or of treatments that people can understand, that everybody understands. And then from there, right, then you go into the individual experience. And then if they're open to it, right, again, it's coming at from where there are, possibly testing them and seeing, how much beyond their boundary can we go, and then going from there. But using common language and really bringing people together as opposed to dividing people is the way that I have tried to approach it my whole life.
Understood. I mean, you've stated so much, the ability to adapt, understanding the schema. I mean, when you understand our conditioning, how difficult it is to accept new ideas and concepts, there's a fear apparently. A lot of your work, Dr. Zappeterra, is both scientific research and clinical healing, centers around cerebrospinal fluid, the CSF. For many people, that term might sound unfamiliar or purely technical. Can you break it down for us? What exactly is cerebrospinal fluid, and what is its primary biological role in the human body?
That's a great question. And I think you pointed on something quite interesting, is that majority of people don't know about it. And so that's the number one focus of my work, is just bringing awareness to the cerebrospinal fluid. And that's it, right? Opening people up to, you have a fluid, and it's exactly what it's named as, is cerebro, which is the brain, spinal, which is spine, fluid. So it's fluid that anatomically bathes the outside of your brain, bathes the outside of your spinal cord, and goes all the way down to your sacrum. So at the end of your spine, you have a bone. It's called the sacrum. and it goes all the way down into, we're all sitting on a pool of cerebrospinal fluid right now when we're sitting. The fascinating part about this is that it's not only on the outside of our brain, but there's actually a hollow tube in the middle of our spine. So in the middle of our spinal cord, so the cord that goes all the way down our spine, there's a hollow tube in the middle of our spine that's filled with fluid. And that's also cerebrospinal fluid. In the middle of our brain, we have what's called ventricles or chambers or cavities. These are cavities that many people don't know exist, but there are cavities we have two what's called hemispheres of the brain. We have two ventricles on either side of the hemispheres, and they come from the front, and they go all the way to the back, and they kind of come around, quite beautiful, almost do like a C shape. And then in the middle, right in the middle, these two cavities, these two ventricles come together and they connect in the middle, is called the third ventricle. And then we go back, and in the back of the close to the cerebellum, which is important for like balance and coordination, is the fourth ventricle. And these cavities are all interconnected. And then from the fourth ventricle, you go down into your spinal cord, so it's all interconnected. Then you get into that hollow chamber, the hollow tube that I mentioned in the spinal cord. So from your brain, these hollow cavities are filled with cerebrospinal fluid. Cerebrospinal fluid fills these ventricles or chambers in the brain itself. It goes all the way down from the brain, all the way down the center of your spinal cord. It bathes the outside of your spinal cord, and it bathes the outside of your brain. So if I was to take your brain out and weigh it, for instance, it weighs approximately 1,500 grams. When it is buoyant, so because you can almost imagine the fluid creates a buoyancy in our body, just like a buoy in the ocean. In our body, the absolute calculated weight of our brain in our head is about 25 to 50 grams. So imagine, right, both with fluid inside and also with fluid outside, that your entire brain and spinal cord, which we call our central nervous system, is totally suspended and floating in this fluid, both from the inside and the out, right? Creating this sort of buoyancy and significantly decreasing the weight of our brain from about 1,500 grams to 25 to 50 grams in our head. So if I even just move my head around, or, I'm playing some sport and I get hit in the head or something like that, the function that we really thought was the main function of the cerebrospinal fluid, which it still is it creates a shock absorption for the brain. And so since it's on the outside and the inside, if I get hit, my brain doesn't instantaneously hit the skull, that there's a fluid layer between my brain and the skull. And so that provides like a shock absorber for the brain. As we started to look into it, and this really came out of my experience learning about craniosacral therapy and about learning about the cerebrospinal fluid when my wife and I were in Santa Fe, and just having these experiences where I started feeling that there was some sort of energy coalescing in my third ventricle, and I was able to locate that because of all my studies of anatomy and physiology and neuroanatomy. And it led the question to, again, being open and curious of what is this, I'm feeling this energy that's coalescing in my third ventricle, or in this area of in my brain. What is this that I'm feeling? And again, keeping it open, right? And investigating it for myself, just like you would any insect, like you were a 2 or 3 year old child looking at a butterfly, right? What do I know? What can I test? Et cetera, et cetera. And I became very interested in the cerebrospinal fluid. And so I started, because I was in the middle of my MD PhD at Harvard, I went to, the best resources for, what published research has shown, and looked, what do we know about the cerebrospinal fluid? And we knew very, very little. Very little. We knew maybe that it had 7 or 8 proteins in it, and it, sort of this shock absorber. And the majority of things that we knew was, if you have meningitis or encephalitis, the fluid gets infected, and we take out the fluid, and that's a way of diagnosing people with meningitis and encephalitis and things like that. So, but we didn't know what its function was at all. And so, when you're in the middle of your PhD and you see a wide open road, and it's something that interests you, I sort of, chose to jump on it and say, wow, we could actually study this fluid and try to determine what its function is, because there was absolutely no doubt that, based on the experiences that I had of this energy that was coalescing in the brain, that it had some sort of profound function. We just needed to be open to it and see what studies we could do and publish. Right. And so the first thing, whenever you're analyzing any sort of anything, it's to be able to describe it. So one of the first things we did is we isolated the fluid. And because we were at Harvard, we had some of the best mass spec machines in the world. And what mass spec allows you to do is it allows you to take a complex fluid like blood or urine or cerebrospinal fluid, and it allows you to separate the proteins in it and analyze the proteins and actually get a list of proteins that are in the fluid. This is very hard to do. Because, especially in complex fluid, because if there's a protein that is highly concentrated, that'll sort of flood the system, and then it'll kind of muck it up, and it's difficult to get the less the proteins that are in less concentration. Anyways, we had one of the best mass specs at Harvard, and in collaboration, we were able to analyze the fluid. And it was one of the first studies where it showed that, there wasn't 7 or 10 or 14 proteins in the cerebrospinal fluid. This was over 100 proteins. And that's quite diverse. That's quite different than 6, 7, 8, 10 proteins. There's over 100 proteins. And so what do these proteins actually do? And so that was our first analysis, was essentially trying to understand what the composition of the fluid was. And based on the composition, could that lead us to understand what the function of this fluid is? And the first thing that we saw was that it had growth factors in it. So growth factors are, like hormones or proteins that are secreted that affect growth, that have some sort of function in terms of telling a cell what to do. Right? And so we found the growth factors in the cerebrospinal fluid of an embryo, which instantaneously told us that if there's growth factors in an in the cerebrospinal fluid of an embryo, those growth factors must be instructing the brain or on some sort of development. And so that's what we spent, a lot of our time doing, was trying to figure out which of the growth factors were important. And unfortunately, there is a bit of a reductionist approach here in terms of picking 1 or 2 or 3 as opposed to the big milieu of factors, just in terms of how research is done. So I was debating with all my advisors in terms of, I want to study the fluid, not this individual factor. And they said, yes, but to get your PhD, we need to study one. We need to get down to one factor, right? But so I kind of kept this. I kind of looked at it as like a magnified glass. Okay, I'm going to keep the whole fluid into perspective, right? But I'm going to hone in on 1 or 2 factors and be able to sort of hone in to focus in on 1 or 2, but then keep an expanded bird's eye view of the entire fluid and go along and do the studies that way. And so what we found was actually that these factors were very dynamic. So when you looked at embryological development, that these factors in the fluid themselves were very dynamic. And why is this important? Nobody had ever looked at the fluid as a mechanism of informing the brain on development or growth. Everybody always looked at the cell, right? So when you grow cells in a laboratory, you grow them in a petri dish and you have to add growth media. You have to add fluid to the cells to keep them moist, to keep the growth factors there, to keep them healthy, to keep them alive. And I would actually, every 2 or 3 days, I would have to change the growth media and give new growth media so that the cells could continue to stay alive, multiply, et cetera, right? So we would always study the cells, but nobody ever looked at the growth media. So what is the growth media, right, of the brain? Well, the growth media of the developing brain as an embryo is amniotic fluid prior, much earlier, and then cerebrospinal fluid. And so if I need to go into a lab and change this fluid and give nutrients and put factors into the fluid for me to grow a cell in a petri dish, well, what is the endogenous, the original fluid of the brain that is doing that for ourselves, for each of us while we're developing? And that actually turns out to be the cerebrospinal fluid. And it's very dynamic. So a growth factor put into the fluid, just like I would put a growth factor into the fluid of a petri dish, would then go and bind to the cells and cause that cell to do a certain function. Right? Well, the cerebrospinal fluid was actually doing that for the brain and the spinal cord. If a molecule was dropped into the cerebrospinal fluid, it could disperse that molecule to all the stem cells of the developing brain and spine. And that then it was essentially providing instructional cues for the development of the brain and the spine, just purely by dropping a growth factor into the brain, into the cerebrospinal fluid. Right. So these factors weren't just present; they were very dynamic. So it shifted. It went, from one day to the next day. There was a big difference in concentration of some of these growth factors, telling us that there was sort of a master machinery that was like, okay, we need to, if you imagine, I sort of see it as cooking is, okay, well, you first you heat up your oil, you throw a little garlic and some onions, and then you let that sizzle a little bit. Then you throw in a tomato and you get that, right? Then some mushrooms and you get that, and then your spices. Imagine that this whole orchestration, right, based on the factors and the growth factors that come into the cerebrospinal fluid, is just that over a period of 9 months. It's like, okay, let's drop this into the cerebrospinal fluid. Good. Now let's pull that back. Let's add a little bit of this. Good. Let's pull back that. And this is all orchestrated based on the development of biology. And so what we found was that the cerebrospinal fluid during embryonic development and even in the adulthood was providing these growth and differentiation factors to the developing brain, and was a niche for stem cells, which means that we could grow and maintain a cell as a stem cell using cerebrospinal fluid alone. So there was this capacity of the cerebrospinal fluid to maintain stem cellness, which is important. After some of the other studies then started looking at what happens in the adult, and in 2013, this was done by scientists in the Netherlands. What they looked at is, they looked at changes in the cerebrospinal fluid in mice that were sleeping, and what they found is that while mice was sleeping, there was a movement of the cerebrospinal fluid into the brain of these mice. and that had never been seen before. And so when we studied the actual composition of the cerebrospinal fluid, one of the things that surprised me the most was how many extracellular matrix proteins there were. And what does that mean? Well, the extracellular matrix is the matrix or the material that is on the outside of cells. Okay, so when you have a tissue that's put together, there's a lot of cells that are put together, but in between these cells, there's a space. Okay, some people call that the interstitial space or the extracellular space. What we noticed in the fluid itself, right, was that there was a lot of extracellular proteins. And so that was surprising to me because I wasn't expecting so many extracellular proteins. So essentially, right, even prior to those studies coming out, it sort of showed that there was a continuum of fluid from the ventricles, from these cavities that I was telling you about, into the brain and back into the cavities, that there was a sort of a mixing, that it was more difficult to actually tell these apart because this was actually sort of a fluid matrix. The cerebrospinal fluid was like a fluid extracellular matrix. It was a fluid matrix. And then as it got into the brain tissue itself, it became more sort of condensed, more differentiated. And in 2013, they actually showed that during sleep, what happens is that these cavities sort of open up in essence, and there is a movement of cerebrospinal fluid into the brain tissue itself during sleep. And the function of it was essentially to clean out the brain tissue while we were sleeping from all the metabolites, all the toxins that had built up over the day from just you using your brain. And so then you go to sleep, and now these open cavities sort of open up, and there's this flushing, almost you imagine as like little tributaries, right? You have a lake in the middle, and then these little tributaries are open, and the water just sort of goes, the fluid goes, and it sort of washes the brain. And then when we wake up, your brain's washed and you feel rested and you feel like you're ready to go for another day, right? And so what they call this the glymphatic system because it's based on the morphology of the glial cells that make up these tributaries in the brain. And now what we understand is that not only does it provide, a shock absorber, a factor of buoyancy, not only, during development does it provide developmental information in terms of growth and differentiation and stem cell niche and provides nutrients to the developing brain, right? Not only does it help with circadian rhythms and diurnal cycles and things like that, but it seems like one of the main functions in the adult, from a purely biological scientific perspective, is to flush out these toxins, to flush out any debris that may build up in our brain during the day that we just use our brain, for daily activities. And so it cleans it out.
Okay.
And so from that, right, you can imagine the number of hypotheses that have come out in terms of, well, if the cerebrospinal fluid isn't flowing, if it's not flowing well and it's stuck for whatever reason, right, are we getting good cleaning? Are we getting a good cleaning? And anybody knows that a river that's flowing is going to be nice and healthy, and it's going to, and then the toxins are not going to build up, and you're not going to have algae building up and mosquitoes and all that stuff. But a river that's stagnant is going to start to get murky. It's going to start to get dirty. It possibly is going to start to, smell bad and stuff like that. And essentially, that's the hypothesis for things like neurodegenerative diseases and Alzheimer's and headaches. And migraines and stuff like that, is that there may be a blockage of the fluid in terms of flow into the brain to clean out the tissues.
You
Okay.
know, Dr. Zappaterra, you've spoken extensively on the biological aspect of the cerebrospinal fluid. I know one of the things you've mentioned, you spoke about a stillness within the fluid and how in that space, the awareness of I am can arise. Can you expand on what that means? Is cerebrospinal fluid simply supporting consciousness, or is it part of the way consciousness expresses itself through the body?
Oh, that's a great question. So, yeah. So, during my experiences, essentially, there was a sense of um, an energy that was coalescing in the middle of my brain. And when I anatomically was able to localize that energy, it was very clear that that was the third ventricle. That the third ventricle is a midline space, and that there was something happening. That there was something happening in the fluid, and that was very profound because many people talk about the third eye as
Yes.
seeing, clear seeing, and usually localize it to sort of the brow center. But if you took a line and went straight from the brow center and from the top of your ear and went straight in, the cavity in the middle of your brain called the third ventricle is where the third eye would lie. Essentially, that is where the third ventricle is. And in the back of the third ventricle, there's the pineal gland. And in the front of the third ventricle, there's the pituitary gland. And then on the sides of the third ventricle, there's the hypothalamus and the thalamus, which are major areas of brain coordination and modulation and relays and just major relay hubs for the brain. And so it was interesting to me that I would feel this sort of energy coalescing in this space. And this then for me became the third eye, that it wasn't the pineal gland, that the pineal gland actually was informing the fluid. The fluid then was transmitting whatever it was that it was transmitting to the entire central nervous system, right? So just looking at it biologically, the pineal gland, for instance, is very important for releasing melatonin. Mm-hmm. Melatonin has been shown to increase in concentration in the cerebrospinal fluid and also in the blood, but mostly in the cerebrospinal fluid. When the lights are dimmed, when the sun goes down, melatonin starts to increase. The pineal gland starts to release melatonin into the cerebrospinal fluid. And the cerebrospinal fluid actually distributes the melatonin to the entire brain. We then might get the sensation of feeling sleepy. And so if you listen to your body and go to sleep, you'll probably fall asleep, and you might sleep for 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 hours. And then prior to waking up, your melatonin from the pineal gland decreases. The amount of concentration of melatonin in the cerebrospinal fluid decreases. The amount then, therefore, that the brain is exposed to decreases, and you wake up and you've had a restful sleep. Right. So purely from a biological perspective, we can see that something is released into the cerebrospinal fluid, and the cerebrospinal fluid acts as a transmitter, acts as a dispersion mechanism for a molecule. Right. And we can go down in terms of number, whether it's the growth factors that I've been talking about, whether it's the hormones, whether it's melatonin, whether it's dimethyltryptamine being secreted by the DMT. Right. By the pineal gland, whichever way you want to look at it. But right. So now shifting our senses a little bit. Right, and asking the next question, which is the question that you asked, which is essentially, well, if it transmits a molecule biologically, right, if it transmits hormones, if it transmits electrolytes, if it can transmit this to the developing brain, and if it can flush out toxins in the adult, et cetera, what other information could it actually transmit? What other information, what other energy could it actually transmit? Right. And so there have been studies. Now there have been studies that have shown that, for instance, the cerebrospinal fluid can transmit information based on movement. So movement of the cerebrospinal fluid, depending on the movement of the cerebrospinal fluid, the frequency or the pulsation of the cerebrospinal fluid can actually transmit information to the brain. Right? There have been photoreceptors that are found on the walls of the ventricles. So one would hypothesize that then the cerebrospinal fluid can transmit light. And there was just a recent paper showing that, in fact, the cerebrospinal fluid can actually transmit photons of light and may actually be a transmitter of light. So now we step back, right, and say, "Wow, this is really interesting." So, as a transmitter of information, right, the fluid, the cerebrospinal fluid, being this totally clear fluid in the middle of our brain, what else could it transmit? Right? What else could it transmit? And so this is where we get into its capacity as a transmitter, its capacity as essentially as a bridge almost from universal consciousness, from some sort of universal energy, that the fluid is being influenced by that energy and is transmitting that energy to our entire nervous system, but is actually transmitting that energy to our entire body. Okay, as a transmitter. That's purely as its function and role as a transmitter. That it is able, that essentially there's a source, okay, that if I had an electrical current in water, okay, or if I wanted to transmit an electrical current through water, that I have a source, and boom, as soon as that electrical current hits the water, instantaneously the entire water is going to feel it, and boom, now I have this energy transfer to my brain, my central nervous system, my spinal cord, all through the fluid instantaneously, right? It's not going, doesn't have to go through anything dense. It's not going through bone. It's not going through anything like that. Through the fluid instantaneously, it gets dispersed. And so that's sort of one of the, that's sort of one of the mechanisms of, could it actually be a transmitter of consciousness, of source energy, of divinity into physical form, almost acting as a converter into physical form. Okay. That's number one, right? The other one is through its properties as it's 99% water. So now you get into some of the properties of water, right? So not only could it be a transmitter, now I'm looking at it as, well, the cerebrospinal fluid is 99% water. Anatomically, it's in a very interesting place. It's in the middle of your brain, middle of your spinal cord. It bathes the outside of your spinal cord. Okay. As we're looking at more and more research into water and the properties of water being able to hold memory, water being able to transmit energy, water having a fourth phase, as studied by Dr. Pollack, showing that water may actually go into an exclusion zone. All right, that instead of H2O, it becomes H3O2, and it forms an exclusion zone. When you form that exclusion zone, you actually separate the ions, and you create an ionic shift. So now you're taking chemical energy, and if you were to put electrodes into that, you can transmit chemical energy into electrical energy. Okay, so now imagine, right, being where it's at, that Dr. Pollack has shown that with certain states, one being the exposure to infrared light, on a hydrophilic surface. So if water is exposed to a hydrophilic surface, and the wall of a cell is a hydrophilic surface, right? So right now we're saying, okay, the fluid is making contact with the wall of the cell. The wall of the cell is hydrophilic. Under certain conditions, that the water might go into a fourth phase, that the water might actually form an exclusion zone. Therefore, could the cerebrospinal fluid, being 99% water, form an exclusion zone under certain conditions? Now we're taking the chemical energy, the ions that are present in the water itself, in the cerebrospinal fluid, and now we can actually take that and convert it into electrical energy, or into some sort of kinetic energy. We're taking a potential energy based on a certain state, right? The water shifts, it goes into the fourth phase, and now we're taking that potential energy, we're taking the potency of the water with all of its electrolytes inside of it, and creating a electrical energy or mechanical energy. And so that's really interesting to me, because many people talk about the inner battery, or the electricity within, or when you talk about many people have had experiences of light beaming from their body, or a laser beam light that emerged from their third ventricle, and they could see it like a beam of light, right? Or when you look at some of these images of people drawing enlightened beings, right? Their whole bodies are glowing. Their whole bodies have this sense of glow, of illuminated, right? Could not only the cerebrospinal fluid be this transmitter of source consciousness through the fluid as the less differentiated body fluid in the body, in the body, and from that it goes to all the other organs, but also as the generator of light itself based on the state that we're in, such that we form an exclusion zone. The body then becomes the circuit, and we're transforming this chemical energy from the ions that are separated into electrical energy. And now we are as individual humans, right? We have an internal battery. There is an internal source of energy. There is an internal illumination, that the body is the circuit, right? And now that may help explain, right, physiologically, this illumination that occurs, this, a beam of light that might be coming out of that people see in their own experiences under deep states of meditation, or whatever it might be. And so now it's not only a transmitter, but it's also a generator. And many people have talked about this inner battery, the inner electricity, allowing the flow of the electricity, recharging the battery, right? What are we doing, again, to recharge the battery? What states are we putting ourselves in that actually allow us to recharge the battery? And what states are we putting ourselves in that allow us to have a conscious connection with this transmitting ability? Because it's always there, right? It's not like it's not there. It's just that when we bring awareness to it, when there is an awareness of it, there's almost an acceleration of the energy. It becomes a relationship, right? So bringing awareness to not only the internal generator, but also the connection with all, because it really is all pervasive. It's everything. It's everywhere. And yet we never investigate that connection. We don't question it. We're not curious about it. And again, going back to, this open curiosity, right? Having this open curiosity of that connection as well as the internal, right? And how this is relating. And what it becomes is it becomes a two-way, it's sort of like a two-way highway. It's, when people say, as above, so below. Well, what does that really mean? When there's a differentiation that's occurring, and there's a de-differentiation. There's a manifesting and there's an unmanifesting. There's a finite and there's an infinite, right? And this is always in constant flux, in constant relationship. And it's a two-way highway. It's not like it's just one, right? It's a relationship. It's a relationship with the infinite from the finite, from our body, right? But recognizing the importance of this human, this body, right? Being embodied, staying embodied, et cetera, et cetera. So that's where I go with it in terms of as a transmitter, but also as a generator.
Dr. Zappaterra, we have been speaking for over an hour. I don't know what your time is like, but there's one more thing I need to ask. I don't know if you have the time.
I do.
Good. Based on what you've just said, it appears as though the cerebrospinal fluid is a sort of conduit between the divine and humanity. What I'm also hearing is a sort of parallel with the Hindu Eastern concepts of Kundalini, with the Shushuma, the Ida, the Pingala, and that energy that goes to the crown chakra. Do you concur with what I'm asking here?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that your word of conduit is spot on. And I think that if you have that understanding of asking about the conduit and, or a bridge, that you investigate that. And I think that the cerebrospinal fluid is actually the biological mechanism for Kundalini.
So that ancient teaching, apparently the ancients at one time was very quite aware of this energy within our bodies.
Absolutely. I mean, we're going back and studying what they did because their understanding of their bodies and their understanding of, the subtle senses within them was outstanding. Right? And even if you look at some of the practices, right, we were talking about the movement of this river within us, right? Even some of the breathing practices that they would do, or the yogic postures, right? Many of their physical practices, breathing, for instance, breathing has been shown to be one of the most profound ways of actually stimulating the movement of this fluid. They absolutely felt that, right? When you ask 99 people, when you breathe, do you feel the movement of your cerebrospinal fluid? 97 will say no, because they've never checked in with it, right? But yet 2 will say, oh yes, absolutely. And as we can train people to be more interoceptive, to have that interoception and learn how to notice more subtle sensations, we can actually, we can train people to actually notice this fluid moving. But they absolutely knew. They felt it. They would do practices, whether it's inverted poses or clenching their perineum, doing stomach and abdominal exercises to get the fluid. You can imagine that if you're feeling kind of a flow, it's kind of they feel it in the way it's described, right, coming from the sacrum, and you kind of feel the energy rising, and you might do some sort of undulating movements with your belly or constricting some of the muscles, right? And this is where they were the premier scientists, because they were asking the questions in real time for themselves, right? Well, if I do this, will this, right? Will this, what will I notice? Will this? And going down these little micro paths consistently, right? Okay, I'm doing this, I'm breathing, right? And what we've known now is that when you take a deep inhale, right? When you take a deep inhale, right? You're bringing that fluid up into your third ventricle. There is when we inhale all the way from our sacrum, the fluid is moving up into our third ventricle. Right? Wow. And so you can see this sort of almost like using the breath and movements and all the energy work that they've done with, postures and things like that, as well as diet and nutrition and fasting and things like that, all to purify the fluid, all so that when it activates and gets into the third ventricle, that it's as pure as possible. And possibly goes into this fourth phase that then creates this internal battery for themselves, and they're illuminated, and the Kundalini has risen, and now there's a fundamental connection with, like you said, and a knowing with cosmic consciousness.
Wow, Dr. Zappeterra, I just want to thank you so much. My deepest thanks, not only for your research, but for the courage to see beyond the microscope, to remind us that what flows within is not just fluid, but intelligence, stillness, and divinity itself. This isn't just science, it's a mirror that invites us to contemplate what does it mean for our health when our biology is sacred? What does it mean for our society when stillness, presence, and consciousness are built into our design? So to my audience, if this conversation has touched you, please share. Click on that subscription. Click on the notification. And Dr. Zappeterra, thank you so much again. We definitely need to do another discourse, because we're now starting to go into the field, into the area that I really wanted to go, right? But this is a question I've been contemplating for quite some time, because I believe that our biology, innately, that aspect of spirituality is wired. And like I said, we are like birds flapping with one wing. And until we learn to recognize that there's another wing, we will always be falling short of what we were designed to do and be. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you.
I look forward.
It was a true honor. Thank you.
Audacious Rebel. Audacious Rebel.